Hello, everyone, and welcome back to America's Wilderness Years. This is the 10th episode, and my name is Isaac Bly, and I'm here with my co host, Lucas Stark. And it is the 3rd of June, 2025. And just before we get into this, I want to say that you might have noticed that we are now on a new channel, and we had some little bit of conflict with YouTube. So we had to start again, which really sucks because we've definitely lost a lot of viewers and we're really building some traction. But try and make the best of what you have. We're looking forward to a fresh start, working a lot more with Kenji and looking into a lot more about history and playing around a lot more with the formula. Luca, why don't you introduce your topics for this week?
Sure. I'm going to be talking about the federal trade court that blocked Trump's tariffs. I'm going to be talking about Elon leaving the administration, and I'm also going to touch on how the Republicans are not having a great time in their town halls right now.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking forward to that last one because I know a lot of sort of like left-wing media will talk about that as like, oh, watch how they're getting owned. But I really think it's important to look at a lot of what's going on the ground. So I also, on my side, I want to look a little bit at how people are responding to ICE. Sometimes they're like pushing back on it. And I also want to talk a little bit about the reparations for the Tulsa massacre from almost more than 100 years ago now. And I also want to look a little bit thinking about how the sort of Trump administration works within the US government and sort of the balance of power within our system. So let's just start off with thinking a little bit about the Supreme Court tariffs thing, because I think there's been a lot of back and forth on this, and it'd be worth getting the record straight.
Well, it's not the Supreme Court, it's the Court of International Trade. And on the 28th, they ruled that the Liberation Day tariff executive order was illegal, essentially outside of the president's authority, because it's not the president's place to be regulating foreign trade outside of like a very urgent situation. That's
Yeah,
for Congress to be doing.
yeah, and that's one of those interesting things about a lot of what Trump has been doing, such as like the Alien Enemies Act or these tariffs, which is a lot of stuff is very clearly after they lost in 2020, the Republicans went into the books to dig up all the obscure laws they could use to bypass our norms so they could seize power for the executive. Some of this stuff is like 100 years old, but it's in this case, the federal court was very clear that this was the rights of Congress and does not meet the standards of what would give the executive these privileges. It's worth noting, like most of these things are not in use anymore.
Yeah, the argument that the administration gave wasn't as bad as with the Alien Enemies Act. They were saying, oh, well, Nixon put tariffs on China at one point in an emergency measure, and we have an emergency too. I mean, not really, but that's what they were trying to push. And I guess it's not as ridiculous. But the court was very clear that this was not an emergency measure. It was just an attempt to completely overhaul the way we conduct trade with other nations by
Yeah.
the power of the executive.
Yeah, because one of the things where if you're going to make this serious, it's all in many ways it's the spirit of the law argument, which is if you're going to make these big decisions about tariffs and about the structure of the U.S. economy, that's something that's supposed to be given to Congress because Congress very explicitly holds the power of the purse. So in certain cases, if the president is doing stuff that is like within executive boundaries, so like defending the nation, obviously you want someone who's able to take quick action. But when you're doing these long-term restructurings, it has very serious questions about what the balance of power is between the three-party system that we in the U.S. have, because I know we have a lot of viewers from not in the country. So in the U.S., we should probably get into this, which is the U.S. has a tripolar system. We have a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive, and they're all basically supposed to counterbalance each other. So theoretically, if the president wants to get very cheeky on spending, then Congress keeps him in line. And you see this now with the big, beautiful bill. Whatever Trump wants to get done, he really has to be funded by Congress. And then there's also the judiciary, which sort of interprets the law and the rules, and the executive, which enacts the interests of the state.
But even within our three branches, there are lower courts or committees that do have quite a bit of influence. And for example, appeal courts, and an appeals court just reinstated the tariffs temporarily because the administration asked for an appeal. So it's not a closed case yet. The appeals court is still deciding on whether or not they're going to side with the administration or with the Court of International Trade, but they're putting a pause on the pause for the tariffs.
Yeah, there's two interesting things I want to get into, which I think slips under the radar from the headlines, which is the first thing is one of the ways the administration frames their problem with these corrupt judges sort of blocking the executive from doing what God had told them they can do, basically, is this idea that it's crazy that like a state judge or whatever, which they often say, in this case, it's a federal court, by the way, so it's like the entire country, can stop like the actions of the federal government from all across the country. That in this one incident, they can freeze everything, which I mean, the problem with this is it's like if the federal government starts taking like your rights away in Montana, I would like that to be able to be stopped in Montana and then everywhere else. So they have to fight it out because we all have sort of the same level of rights and all of this. It's just one of those things which is you have to think about this in the context of what it's going to be like for the next 20 years. Like when Trump isn't around, like do you want the government to be able to violate your rights with no consequences and there be no way to freeze it or put it on hold? In this case, it's a national policy. And the other thing is, so we've talked about this before, which is sort of the nightmare scenario you can imagine is where Trump is just all out, no one can resist him, which is sort of the narrative they want to push. But what you're seeing here is he didn't say, go to hell, I'll do it on my own. He had them file an appeal to preserve his actions there. I think that's one of the things we see is pretty consistently when polled, Americans say he should obey the rules. He should listen to the Supreme Court. Almost universally, they say that.
Yeah.
And some people would also say that when you really attack rule of law, when you attack stability, when you attack these rights, you endanger the economy by a large amount because property rights are always a huge part of the growth of stable economies. And I think there's something to that where you see him feel sort of endangered when Wall Street starts getting hits. He started to question tariffs, which were one of his like core almost identities.
Yeah. And I felt pretty relieved when I first heard about this. I mean, of course, the freeze on the freeze is unfortunate, but I still am feeling a little more optimistic now because these tariffs are some of the most irresponsible uses of executive power in our nation's history. Not only have they increased our cost of living, they're pretty much increasing the government's cost of living because they were supposed to help raise tax revenue while other taxes were being lowered. But Trump is so wishy-washy about them, and is pausing them and raising them and lowering them all the time that we're not really getting that much revenue from them anyways.
Well, I think this is you hit on something interesting here, which is that there's two problems, I suppose you could say. I mean, the overlying problem is that no economist would recommend doing this unless the economist was theoretically planning on killing themselves. Because it's a non-issue that your solution doesn't even solve, and it just hurts you and hurts everyone else and weakens you in every single possible way. You're the worst country you could possibly do this. But the premise of what Trump is saying is that one, we'll raise tariffs and that'll make us a lot of money so we can remove like income tax, which I mean that's kind of how taxes worked like 200 years ago, but that's not the way we live now. And also income and tariffs are basically income tax anyways, or sales tax. Tariffs are basically a tax anyways because it raises the cost on imported and exported goods. So it's not like we're really saving money. We're just moving the budget around. And then the other thing is that he says we'll raise the tariffs and we'll make money from that. Okay, right? That's theoretically possible. But the other thing he also argues is because the tariffs will be so high, we'll be importing less stuff, so we'll be making more stuff on our own. Those two things are literally mutually they're not mutually exclusive, but they're in opposition to each other. They're opposed. One of them requires more goods to be tariffed and to raise money. The other one requires less stuff to be imported, so we build our own stuff. And none of this is going on with like subsidization or anything like that. And it's a really insane economic policy And I think it puts a lie to something that I was told all throughout my life as a kid, which is economics is such a very rational thing. It's often out of the hands of statesmen, and in many ways, the president has limited control over the economy. But I think something we are learning now, I think we saw this with Vladimir Putin in 2022. People said, "Why would Putin invade? He's going to lose a bunch of money, and it's going to be very bad for the economy, and the oligarchs will overthrow him." Which is that how much power capital really has, I think, is always been very political, and the power that states have is very real. And I think hand in hand with what the Pentagon would call great power competition returning, you're also seeing the return of sort of the politics of the economy. And hopefully that won't be as foolish as this going forwards. Now, I guess we should talk about the other big spender losing money in the White House, who's actually out now, Elon Musk.
Yeah, Elon has been a little notorious lately for being at the head of Doge, the Department of Government
Dodge.
Efficiency. Yeah, it's pretty dodgy.
Yeah. Although, you know what? I will say one thing. They did get Elon Musk fired.
Yes, he announced on the 28th that he was leaving his position in Doge and was going to be returning to being the CEO of his company. I don't think he was ever not the CEO, but for what was it, 130 days ish,
Yeah.
he was a special government employee.
Yeah.
So not necessarily the head of Doge, but was probably calling a lot of the shots. And
It's worth saying that Doge was never a department. That's just not how it works. He was a special advisor, so he didn't have to go through normal processes.
yeah, and it was only a few days away from when his contract was supposed to be terminated, but it seems like he announced his departure a little early. And that was a little weird to me, especially because just a day before, he publicly criticized the big, beautiful bill that's going through the Senate right now.
Is that the disgusting abomination comment?
It was something like that. He said it was undermining Doge's work, that it was going to cost the government money. And this maybe suggests that there was tensions between Musk and Trump's cabinet that boiled over because of that comment. Maybe that was just a little too embarrassing for them.
Well, I think actually, so there's a long-term trend, and a lot of this is very secretive, and I hate speculating on this, so I'm just going to pose a couple of theories or frameworks of analysis because I don't want to go get too much into sort of the drama behind this because it's always very secretive. Although we're saying historically, a lot of these hiring and firings are very personal, so it could be something entirely different. But he had very serious agreements with Scott Bessent about the tariffs because, I mean, he imports a lot of stuff, so it's going to be a very problematic, and it's economically very stupid. Don't get it twisted. MAGA might be saying all these tariffs are going to be great in all of this, but there is absolutely no way they are not seriously questioning this. And time again, they seriously said, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe this is a bad idea. This will raise costs. So it's the whole level of like misinformation, but like they can see the line go red too. And they're aware the bond market has not recovered, even if the stock market has recovered in many ways. And that's equally concerning because it questions the power of the US dollar. The thing, so you have the idea of the economics thing, which he wants to focus on his business. The Trump administration isn't doing business, and then he's struggling to make the tax cuts. And there's also like, how much does he fit in? We know he had a really strong disagreement with Scott Bessent. There is this idea from a former White House staffer, Anthony Scaramucci, when he worked for Trump, and he argued that it's possible that Musk and Trump just couldn't work in personality wise, and Musk had just basically paid Trump to let him in, and now he sort of outlived his usefulness to Trump, or however much their quote unquote contract was made. And it's worth saying, Elon Musk gave a lot to Donald Trump.
Yes, he invested a lot of money into the campaign. And although he's leaving now, Doge is going to continue operating. And well, just under Musk's supervision, they have removed like 260,000 federal workers, which is like 12% of the federal workforce.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone that's tried to interact with a government service or agency has probably noticed that they're a little shorthanded now.
Yeah. And also, one thing I'd say is that it's kind of a misunderstanding that firing a lot of government employees would save money because most of the time, all of these services are still required. So like they'll
Yeah.
dissolve this office and people will just be calling around trying to find the office and someone will have to do the work anyways and they'll have to rehire a bunch of air traffic controllers because all the planes are exploding or whatever. And also that federal employees are really trying to help us. If you ever interacted with one, you've had a lot of frustrations dealing with them. But they get paid below a market rate, so they don't actually cost us as much as you would think. And it's also worth remembering, we talked about this in like the second episode, the Doge is costing us a lot of money through the chaos it's causing in our tax collection system, which is ignoring the point, which is part of the big beautiful bill, is saving trillions of dollars for billionaires.
Yeah. And I think a big motivation for Elon leaving is actually trying to save money for himself because he thought that if he hopped on the Trump train and helped Trump's campaign and all that and allied himself with the administration, that this would be good for his business and that people would be buying his cars more and buying stock in Tesla. But the opposite has happened. There's been a massive backlash towards his public image and his involvement in the administration. So now I think maybe he's thinking, I need to try and reverse this. I need to step away from politics. I need to become,
Find some way to get people to like me.
yeah, I need to become a 2016 Elon Musk where people think that I'm Tony Stark or whatever, but a little racist.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't think we've seen the end of Elon Musk, unfortunately, but he's very clearly had a very major impact on the U.S. sort of political and financial sort of system, and the role he's played with like the giving out millions of people to register to vote, basically by signing into his PAC, and all of that was so brazen and so ideologically charged. And I think the one upshot to this is Elon Musk was always a very radical, very extremist person. I think in a lot of ways Trump is not a particularly ideological person, but he's not the only one who's left office. And I actually want to talk about this because I think it's gone under the radar a lot, which is that the Trump administration fired two of the top ICE officials basically because they're trying to drive up deportations. Like Stephen Miller was complaining that, you know, why aren't you guys going to the 7-Elevens? Why aren't you guys going to all these hotels? Why aren't you rounding up more migrants to deport more people? Because we want to get those numbers up, up, up. Because they're just not at the rate that they want, and it's extremely, extremely expensive.
I hadn't heard about these firings. Who are these guys?
So yes, the two people who were removed was Caleb Vitello and Kenneth Genelo, who were both very high level ICE officials. And a lot of this came to us from this interview that happened with Stephen Miller, who's the deputy chief of staff to the White House, on Fox News, who was complaining that ICE needs to be pushing for a minimum of about 3,000 arrests per day, which is insane and requires almost an unfathomable level of investment that we're just not seriously going to make. And I mean, 3,000 a day. And remember, they're mostly deporting like non-criminals and sometimes even American citizens. And so this would be a lot of people. And statistically speaking, like if 1% of these are American citizens, which statistically speaking, that's way less than has actually been so far, then that's more than one American citizen being deported every day.
That
would be like, even if it's 1%, what would statistically be? What, that'd be 30%. That'd be 30 American citizens deported a day if it was 1% of Americans. If 1%, just less, like that's an incredible amount. And the complete indifference to the way they react about this stuff, even if you get into most of the people who have been deported, like majority of them aren't criminals. So at least like 1,500 citizens, 1,500 Americans or illegal immigrants would be deported for no reason because they have committed no crimes. So it's just an incredible number, and it's so arbitrary. Like it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Great Leap Forwards, where they're just making up what numbers they think they need to have, and then they're just trying to find a way to meet the quota when it's not based on like sort of any practical reality there. And the cost of this is often involved in, like we talked about in New Jersey, like private companies, this prison industrial complex, the development of these large data sets. And remember, Doge got into a lot of our private details and took them out from like sort of a public secure location. So there's a very clear development of a very serious apparatus to surveil and repress people. But I think one of the upshots, and just before we wrap up, because it hasn't been a super busy week, but there's a lot of interesting stuff to get into, I want to talk about is a little bit more stuff on the ground. So will you talk a little bit about these town halls? Because you see some of this stuff on like sort of like more left wing stuff like Midas Touch or on TikTok, but I think it would be good to give people some more context on those stories.
Yeah, this week, Republican senators and representatives who actually held physical in-person town hall meetings were getting some real backlash from their constituents. And it's mainly about the big, beautiful bill that's in the Senate right now. And as an example of the kind of heat they're getting, Representative Mike Flood of Nebraska, who's a Republican, was shouted at during a town hall meeting after he admitted he was not aware at the time of voting that the Big Beautiful bill contained a provision that would prevent court or federal judges from holding government officials in contempt of court.
Yeah, and that's because of a weird thing about how they fund that.
And this also implies that he didn't really read the whole thing, although it's like 1,000 pages. So, like, you know, I guess it's understandable, but also it's
your
very
job.
embarrassing. It is your job.
Put that shit in ChatGPT, dude.
Just get like an intern or somebody to read it for you. Like, geez.
He gave you serfs for a reason.
And another example of this was that a Republican Senator, Joni Ernst of Iowa, was told by a constituent that cutting Medicaid and SNAP would cause people to die. And her response to that was, well, we're all going to die.
And it's clear she did clarify this, which is like, yes, eventually everyone is going to die of old age. And like she's like, oh, and do you want to cover the tooth fairy next? And I think there's two things I want to flag about this, which is one, if the best thing you can come up with is telling everyone, don't worry, you'd be dead anyways, that does not indicate to me you have a very solid platform.
Yeah, it's so not helpful.
I mean, it's not like, because you're saying, oh, people were saying that I meant you're going to die no matter what, you're doomed anyways. But her kind of point was like, well, why would I spend money on you? You're all going to die anyways. We're all going to die. Who gives a shit about healthcare? Which is funny because the person was asking, like, we'd all like to not die so much. I think it's interesting because these are very weird, because it reminds me of a lot of problems with open source information, which is, you know, if you're watching this, you're part of a more networked sort of digital community, which is sort of responsively being directed by the algorithm. But when you're in that room, the dynamics are very different. And the Republicans often say, you know, these are paid actors, because obviously no one would disagree with me because of all the people on Twitter who agree with me. It's also important to note that, like, even as someone who's really interested in politics, I basically never watched one of these town halls. I've gone to like a couple when I was younger, but the role they've taken, I think, is very interesting. It's something we want to finish talking about as this episode wraps up. We're just sort of looking at the role of the little guy, because we've talked about this before. You know, the Democratic Party is in hibernation, what you call the Fabian strategy, what I call really stupid. Which is seeing, I think there's something to people wanting to see these officials held more accountable, and seeing people on the ground sort of complaining and making their voices heard. And I think people don't feel like there's that much resistance. So I think there's a lot more engagement in that. I think one of the things that stands out to me now is there's another video. And remember, like, obviously these are anecdotal, but I think there's something reflective about that. And, you know, to be fair, the algorithm makes sort of these systems for us anyways.
On the topic of standing up to authority, could you fill us in on what happened in San Diego? Because there was quite a few videos circulating about people going up and protesting an ICE raid, right?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, because there was a popular San Diego restaurant, I believe the name was Bueno Franchetta, which was raided by ICE. So you had these guys coming in basically like commando gear, like the helmets and the personal face coverings, and, you know, M4s with all these attachments, and they were trying to basically kidnap these workers. And the community actually started to complain and push back and be like, get out of here, you know, you don't belong here. And they used tear gas against these people complaining about this, against these Americans complaining about how they're attacking this Italian restaurant. and several workers were ultimately detained. But you saw like a very visceral like sort of like protesting and complaining, and people were like yelling profanities and calling these people fascists. And again, talking about anecdotes, which is this is not the norm, both in like America throughout time and also how ICE is handled. And but it's really incredible to see because this is ICE basically fighting American citizens because they need to finish deporting people with no trial, presumably. And that's just what's happening in the on American streets now. And you see this a lot. We talked about this in like the first episode. You see like a lot of areas that used to be frequented by Hispanic folks, and they're just not out as much because there's a certain sense of fear. And I think that's kind of embarrassing to think about.
Yeah, it's really sad to see, and I guess it's nice that people are standing up for their neighbors, but this does seem to be the exception to the rule, and that a lot of people aren't necessarily.
Yeah, but sometimes it only starts, and so it has to start somewhere, is what I would say.
Yeah, and I suppose the internet does help with that because we can see we can see individual people's perspective of these incidents, not just what a reporter sees.
Yeah, I'm also really digging this angle of not just looking at the headlines, but trying to pick around through social media. And I mean, obviously these are anecdotes, but to look at the little guy there, because I mean, I think there can be too much of just talking about what Trump is doing this week. And the truth is, I think Trump's been trying to recover this week from his sort of push last week. And just before we wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about a really interesting story that I really want to talk about, which is reparations for the Tulsa race massacre from 1921, sometimes called the Tulsa riots, which were basically this 2-day long pogrom against the affluent parts of the black community within the Tulsa, particularly called like this area called like basically Black Wall Street, which was basically destroyed by white supremacists. And there's now going to be a payment, reparations of about $100 million for that destruction. And this was a lot of destruction back in the time. But I think is really incredible because that wasn't the product of one day. That wasn't the product of one person declaring these things. It was a product of almost more than 100 years of activism and of preserving memory and responsibility by people. And like Biden visited recently when he was president, and there's been a huge campaign for like activism and restoring black businesses and just raising awareness for this stuff. And I think not too long ago, the idea of getting reparations for that would have seemed impossible, but it's a reality now, and it's really positive to see that there's something that's might be able to come of that insane destruction.
Yeah, I really didn't think that the government was up to something like this, but ironically, it's happening under Trump, and I imagine it just flew under his radar because he probably wouldn't have liked it if he had noticed it.
Yeah, maybe, but maybe they'd stop him too. I mean, this was a campaign that went on for more than 100 years. Like 4 years of Trump, they could persevere through that. And you got to remember the process to get here for the people of Tulsa to get these reparations. Like they went through a lot of stuff to get there. They had to go through the war on drugs and all of this stuff. And it's not necessarily a sign of resilience, but it's a sign of that as deep rooted as so many of the problems in America seem, and as much work as it takes to solve them, there can still be justice and there can still be change.